Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton. Today we are back with Ken Griffith to talk more about his revision of ancient chronology in a biblical framework. In the last session, we talked about the Tower of Babel down to the period of the Exodus, and today we're going to pick up with the Exodus and go down to the period of King Saul. Before we get into today's discussion, I just want to say that I've recently published a book, Christ in All Things, Essays on Scripture and Theology, which compiles 7 of my essays on the Bible, theology, and creation. And you can buy that book at the link below. But with that said, thanks so much for coming on, Ken, and look forward to getting into it.
Thank you, Seraphim. Thank you.
So
go ahead.
So to tell us a little bit about the way that the Exodus transforms ancient Egypt, particularly as we enter into the Hyksos period. So there are 4 dynasties that are usually assigned to the Hyksos period. That's 14, 15, 16, and 17. What role do these dynasties play in your reconstruction of history?
Well, certainly. Let me do a screen share with you. This is a zoomed in part of our ancient history master chart that's available free on my academia page. So on the left, I know it's a little complicated. This red bar on the left is the Exodus, 1491 BC. And way over on the right, it's about 430 years later. King Saul began to reign right around 1095 BC. And this is King Ahmose I of Egypt. So you've got about a 430-year period that this group called the Hyksos ruled Egypt. What we found was, as we talked about in our previous episodes, Egypt had been ruled by a different dynasty in each of the major cities. So you had the 14th dynasty in the Delta. You had the 13th dynasty based in Thebes. You had the 16th dynasty also based in Thebes. And you had the 8th dynasty, which was based in Memphis. So this is the continuation of the previous dynasties in those cities that we were talking about last time. So what happened was, after the Exodus, you had King Merenre II got killed, probably in the Red Sea, in our view. King Ka-Ankra Sobekotep also got killed. He was the king of the 13th dynasty. And
that's who Corville identifies as Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Correct. And we agree with him. He definitely died at the time of the Exodus. The question was it the night of the firstborn? Because he appears to have been the firstborn in his family. Right. Whereas Merenre II is definitely a second-born son of Pepi.
Okay.
So at any rate, Nitocris or Nefer, I can't pronounce her Egyptian name. I'm sorry. I'll just stick with the Greek. Nitocris, she basically took over, according to Herodotus, as queen of Egypt for 12 years after the death of her husband. And after her death, you had the 8th dynasty begin. And she apparently had a son named, I think it was Neferkari the Younger. And the fact that you have a younger son coming to the throne immediately after these events would also be a signature of the angel of death killing the firstborn sons. About a decade earlier. So what we found was, with her death, the Hyksos completely took over Egypt, and they conquered Memphis first, and then a few years later they conquered Thebes and established the 16th dynasty there. And then you have the 15th dynasty was the main Hyksos, I guess the top ruling dynasty, and they were ruling from the city of Avaris, which the Bible calls Hawala. Or Havilah, and that's on the border between Egypt and Israel, pretty close to the border today. So you have this this massive invasion of these Arabs, the Hyksos being Amalekites and Edomites. They are tribes descended from Esau, but you could probably view them more broadly, as we discussed last time, also as tribes descended from Abraham, who had also hybridized with the Canaanites. So it's kind of a fusion of the Arab and the Canaanite culture.
So you're saying the 14th dynasty is uh, that has a relationship to the Israelites, is it?
Well, it
And
did. Yeah.
okay.
So with the Exodus, I think the Israelites left, and this was taken over by probably their Amalekite cousins. However, the book of Joshua strangely says that when it's listing where they went in the conquest, it says they went all the way to Goshen. So it's possible that they literally went all the way, conquered all the way to Goshen, and it's possible they may have installed an Israelite person back on the 14th dynasty throne. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate too much about that. I just note that the Bible says that, therefore it's a data point.
Okay. So the Amalekite conquest of Egypt is really a central feature of your revision of ancient history and a number of other revisionist accounts of the relationship of Egypt to the Bible. So could you explore the connection between the Amalekites, the period of the Judges, and the international situation during this period?
Absolutely. So after Nitocris died 2 years later, 1477 BC, according to Berosus, he says the Arabs and the Phoenicians were in a war with the Chaldeans, and they basically defeated Babylon. And they established what Berosus called the Arabian dynasty of Babylon, which lasted 245 years. We have from other dates that he gives us that this Arabian dynasty was established in 1477 BC. We believe that what he is describing, and he got this from a fragment of Eusebius. He's describing the invasion of the Guti, who sacked Akkad. We believe that Akkad and Babylon were the same city, that Akkad is the older name and Babylon was the newer name, which goes back to there was a king of Akkad named Sargon the Great. He was kind of the founder of the Akkadian Empire, and he claimed that he conquered this region to the north called Subartu. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, but up there in the north where I had the Gutians. And he claimed that he took the priesthood of Babylon and he built a new Babylon next to his city of Akkad. So you have a major empire ruler claiming he moved Babylon. And we believe that
Two different cities that are called Babylon, you're saying.
yeah, that there was a Babylon 1 and a Babylon 2.
And is the Babylon 1, just to clarify for myself, is the Babylon 1, is that where you think the Tower of Babel was constructed, or is that a different thing?
It's at the center of the pre-pottery Neolithic culture, which is another major, you could do a whole episode on this.
Yeah.
But the point was that he claims that he moved Babylon. Now, there are other scholars, and they say that the Tower of Babel was down here in the south, down near the mouth of the Persian Gulf at a city called Eridu. So either way, Christian scholars apparently believe Babel had to have been moved, and that Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar, was a later city, a different city than the actual Tower of Babel. So at any rate, we believe that Akkad was basically overthrown by this group called the Gutians, or the Guti, and we believe that they were the tribe of Gether, who was one of the sons of Aram. And if you note Abraham's early history, Abraham started up here in Haran and Urfa, and he moves down to Israel, but then he sends his servant back to Haran to get a wife. Well, this was the region of the Arameans, and even at one point in the Bible, it says your father was a wandering Aramean. So there's this connection in the early days to Abraham's culture and the culture of Aram, and we believe that there's this group called the people of the East in the Bible, and it's talking about the sons of Abraham, but it also refers to the Amalekites and the Edomites and the Midianites, Midian also being descended from Abraham, and the Arameans. So this people of the East, interestingly, in Sumeria, they are called the Amuru, which means the people of the West. And the reason is that from their perspective, these tribes, these nomadic tribes, are in the West. But from Abraham's perspective in Canaan, they all went to the east side of the Jordan River and that great Rift Valley. And so from Abraham's perspective, these were the people of the East. And so what we have evidence is that in the reign of Shari, who was the last king of the truly united Akkadian Empire, we have the year names of the actual, they would name every year, not year number 5 of the king, but they would say the year that this happened, and they would name it after an official as well. So he has 2 year names named after his defeats of the Amorites, and 2 year names named after his defeats of the Guti, or the Gutians. And we believe that these tribes basically allied, and that they overthrew the Akkadian Empire, and that they killed King Shari. And
So you've dated this at 1477 BC, and your date for the Exodus is what year?
1491 BC.
So this is while Israel is in the wilderness in your account.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Israel is somewhere up here where Amalek originally started, where I have it marked on the map. Amalek went into Egypt. Israel came out roughly to where Amalek was during the wilderness sojourn, at least according to Deborah Hearn and a number of other scholars. They pretty much place the wilderness sojourn between the this is the Gulf of Aqaba and the Dead Sea. So roughly in the Araba area.
Okay.
So you have these invaders, and it's interesting that both the Sumerian king list says when the Gutians invaded us, they have no king who's famous. They say they are all kings. And in Manetho and also in Egyptian records, we have a similar statement about the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, who invaded Egypt. They said that they were all kings. So apparently these Arabic, Abrahamic, and Aramean tribes had some kind of a egalitarian political philosophy where they didn't believe in kingship. They apparently believed in maybe the assembly, kind of like you see in the Bible, the assembly of Israel. And so it's interesting that according to our chronology, we have similar groups with similar ideologies taking over both of the centers of civilization, Egypt and Babylon, within 15 years of each other.
And this moves the conventional date for the fall of Akkad significantly.
About 700 years.
Okay.
It's placed, they place it 2200 BC, which we would place, that's even before, that's while while people were at the tower, Babel was 2200 BC.
Right. Okay, so is this the Joshua's long day slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you've suggested that there's in the year of Joshua's long day, and for viewers who might only vaguely remember the story, this is where Joshua prays that the sun would remain in the sky for a longer period of time than it usually does in order that Israel might complete the battle they were fighting. So you've suggested that Joshua's long day correlates with a worldwide catastrophe, which is documented in other ancient sources. So could you just explore that for us and the connection among these various data points?
Absolutely. So here's another zoomed in area of our chart, just below the slide I showed you earlier. So we have roughly this red line again being the Exodus. In the Greek history, they record this event called the Fire of Phaeton that happened in the year 1521. And at the same year, they also record the flood of Deucalion. And we believe what this probably was something called the Younger Dryas impact event. And also the Greeks basically made up this story of Phaeton asking to drive the chariot of the sun, and then Zeus striking him to the ground with a thunderbolt as a way to explain what they saw. But basically the Younger Dryas impact theory is that a comet struck the earth. Well, it broke into pieces before it struck the earth, and it struck mainly the polar ice cap in North America and Greenland and Europe. And effectively it started a process of the ice caps in the North American ice sheet breaking up. And there was an immediate flood at that time, which apparently was the Black Sea overflowing into the Mediterranean basin, and it caused a flood in the Greek area, or the Troad area. And it's known to the Greeks as the flood of Deucalion. which they mix up with the Great Flood because they add some of the story elements of Noah to the Deucalion flood. But it's definitely datable. They give us a number of ways to measure the year that it happened. And then, so you have the Exodus occurring.
Just clarify, maybe one or two of those ways in which you triangulate the date for the flood of Deucalion.
The Greeks give it by years of the king and whose reign it happened. And I believe it was 2 generations before Ogyges. No, it was 2 generations before Cecrops. And Athens was founded about 50, 60 years later, which is the second flood I'm going to talk about, which was a result of the first. So you have a regional flood in this year, which is roughly 1521 BC. But then you have about 60 years later, which is actually pinpointed dated to 1450 BC by 2 different cultures, the Greeks and the Hindus. What we believe happened was the comet strike started breaking up the ice sheet, and it coated it with soot, and it basically impact melted a large amount of that water, but it was dammed up basically where Hudson Bay is. So you have a huge, massive, it was a 2-mile thick ice sheet before it got struck. And effectively, it took 40 or 50 years, and it appears to have had a dam breach of some kind that enabled it all to slide into the Arctic Sea through the Hudson Bay in the year 1450. And it's recorded in both the flood of Dardanus that basically the Mediterranean Sea refilled and came back up to what's now the current sea level. And also in India, they say the city of Dwarka with their temple sank. The sea claimed the temple. And also in Sri Lanka, they say they had a school called the Tamil school, and it was swallowed by the sea in the same years. And they also date that to the year after the death of Krishna. And what's his name? Alexander Hamilton was an author in the 1700s, not the one who was involved with the U.S. Constitution, but a different Alexander Hamilton. He was a British, basically, envoy in India, and he studied under the Brahmas there, and he kind of decoded their chronology, and he, using their dates based on the Kali Yuga, they know the exact year that who they call Krishna was born and when he died. And obviously they worship Krishna as a god, but he basically identified Krishna as Moses, having been deified and being worshipped as a god by the Hindus. And interestingly, that tradition places his death in the year 1451 BC, and they say that Dwarka sank the year after he died.
So how would information about Moses, or this tradition about Moses, reach India according to Hamilton?
He didn't go into a lot of detail on that, but we know that after the 10 tribes were sent into exile, that some of them actually ended up in India. There's a number of traditions. A number of them ended up in Afghanistan as well. And so it's very possible that that tradition came from them, or it could be an older tradition.
Sure. Yeah, I remember there was an Orthodox Jewish presentation my brother was telling me about, just the gentleman was connecting kind of various texts in Isaiah about the people of the East with some of Abraham's other children. And so there are various interesting arguments that I've heard of, though I haven't looked into in detail, about connections between India and ancient Israel. So that's an interesting suggestion.
Yeah. So obviously this is us cobbling together a different field of study into history because we think we recognize the effects of this event. So if you ask anyone who is a scientific advocate of the Younger Dryas impact event, they will say, no, it happened in 12,000 BC. So we believe it triggered another event, and what the event that we think is associated with the flood of Dwarka and also the flood of Dardanus was that basically the ice melts and it slides into the sea, and the sea level rises. But another element that the geologists will tell you is that the Mediterranean was originally cut off from the Atlantic, and the rate of evaporation is so high that it would go dry in about 1,000 years even today. If you built a dam at the Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean Sea would only take 1,000 years to drop by about 5,000 feet. And this map shows this where the sea would be if the sea level was 5,000 feet lower. And you can see that the Aegean Sea is completely dry. And the Greek poets sang about this. They said during the time of the fire of Phaeton that the Cyclades became mountains. The islands of the Cyclades became mountains, and the Nile ran down to the abyss in canyons of the delta. And you can see that the Nile Delta does actually extend down to the abyssal plain down here. So what apparently happened, and the geologists call this the Zanclean flood, is at some point the ice sheets melted enough that the global sea level rose and it overtopped this, what was then the Isthmus of Gibraltar, and turned it into the Strait of Gibraltar, where you had effectively a dam breach. And it took, they say it took somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months to refill the entire Mediterranean Sea and even overflow into the Black Sea. This would be a completely massive shift of weight on the surface of the Earth, which would affect the Earth's rotation in a certain way. If you take say a soccer ball and you glue a couple of weights on it and you spin it and drop it in a swimming pool, so you spin it as fast as you can, you drop it in a swimming pool so it's floating, the weights will move to the equator of the soccer ball, meaning they'll roll until they are as far from the polar axis of the ball as they can get. And the Earth is the same way, is that the current position of the Earth as it rotates, with the Himalayas kind of close to the equator and not all the way down, but the Earth has basically rolled until it has the highest amount of mass around the equator. Well, if you suddenly took a big chunk of mass, like a 2-mile thick ice sheet from a large area of one part of the Earth, and then you deposit it by refilling this ocean basin, you're moving mass from one place to another, and the Earth is going to respond to that by rolling until it restabilizes, and the North Pole might even move. So it's interesting that we have 3 different sources placing this massive flood in that year, and then you have the events of Joshua, Jericho, and the Long Day in the same year by Usher's chronology, or I think we are 1 year behind, 1 year after Usher on that point. And so here's a visualization of the dam break refilling the Mediterranean Sea. And I wanted to show you this video. This is called the Janabekov effect, and it was discovered or rediscovered on a Russian space mission back in I think in the 80s, maybe earlier. What they found is that if you have an object rotating, but it's 3 different moments of inertia around different axes, it'll do this thing called a Janabekov flip. And so it rotates one way, and then it flips, and then it flips. But if you try it with a bottle of water, it'll only flip once or twice, maybe 3 or 4 times, and then it'll stabilize because the water redistributes the energy. So all that, I don't want to get too crazy far into all that. The main point is that we have a record that there was this massive flood, and then we also have a record that there was a major disturbance in the normal rotation of the Earth and the rising and setting of the sun and the moon. And history seems to link them all together, and we think that that's probably a big part of effectively the end of the Ice Age in world history.
So this is intelligible within conventional physics?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So to get into, what James Jordan likes to call a little bit of the deep weird, you've suggested some really interesting connections among Sidon, Hyksos, and the legendary city of Atlantis. So I hope that's not a trigger word for anybody, but would you just tell us a little bit about those connections?
Well, certainly. First, we don't attribute any kind of we don't view Atlantis as some kind of founder civilization or anything like that, but we do view the story that Plato was told by the Egyptians as probably historical. And we have 2 durations that tell us when that happened. So I'm going to give you a theory about it, but first I'll show you the historical durations. And this is what was from a paper we did on durations to the founding of Carthage, where we used kind of the same method that we use for all of our book.
Would you be able to just max that out so that it comes out clear on the screen? Thanks.
Yep, thank you. So we have a lot of different durations for the debate over when Carthage was founded, but Carthage was the daughter city of Tyre. Tyre was the city on the coast of effectively just north of Israel, or really it was Israel in the ancient times. And we have durations from the founding of Tyre to the founding of Carthage, but we also have durations from the founding of Tyre to the destruction of Sidon, which was the mother city. Basically, we're told by Pompeius Trogus that the city of Sidon was destroyed in a war, and the refugees moved and they founded Tyre 1 or 2 years later. So we have Herodotus said that the priests of Tyre told him their temple had been founded 2,300 years before his time. And usually when they say his time, they either mean the year he was born, or they could mean the Greek era from the first Olympiad, 776. We found that different groups use that differently. But 2,300 years before Herodotus was born seems far too old for the city of Tyre, as even conventional scholars will tell you. But we found that there was a unit of time that the ancients used that is described by Semiramis, and this was called the quadrimestral, which means 4 months. Like the Greeks, basically, they considered there to be 3 seasons in a year. So if you divide the year by 3, you end up with 4 months. And so effectively what they're doing is they're using a third of a year and calling it a year, or they knew the difference, but for some reason in the translation, it didn't get translated correctly. Or the other possibility is the priests are deliberately playing games, and we see a lot of cases of that. If you take the 2,300 years and instead you treat it as quadrimestrals, you get 767 years before the birth of Herodotus, which gives us an approximate date for the foundation of Tyre as 1251 BC. And we have a duration from Josephus of 240 years from the founding of Tyre to the founding of Solomon's temple. And if we use Ussher's date for Solomon's temple, that gives us 1251, 1252 BC for the founding of Tyre. And then we have a third duration. Herodotus tells us that he was told by Plato told us that it was 9,000 years before Amasis, the king Amasis of Egypt, was this Atlantean war, the War of Atlantis. And he said that the Atlanteans conquered basically the delta of Egypt, as well as other areas. Well, if you take those 9,000 years as lunations, you end up with 727 years. And if you count that before the death of Amasis, it again comes to 1252 BC. And so we have basically 3 durations that seem to indicate that there was this war with this power that in that story they're calling the Atlanteans, but we believe it was basically just the Canaanites, effectively the Canaanites and their overseas colony of Atlantis. And I'll get into that a little more here in a minute. Let me see. And this goes back to a theory that we have now, the deep weird. So this is a petroglyph from Armenia, and it appears to show the division of the earth into 4 quarters, and then people standing on each quarter. The ancients worshiped this group of great gods called the Anunnaki. They said there were 8 great Anunnaki, and then there were 50 lesser Anunnaki. And this was the religion in Sumeria, Babylon, and the Hittites, as well as some of the other nations of the Middle East. And if you read all the sources that mention the Anunnaki, they continually mention this one accomplishment of the Anunnaki was that they divided the world into the four regions. And we find in Plato's story about Atlantis, he says that the gods have divided the world amongst themselves, and the lot that fell to Poseidon was the island of Atlantis. We recognize Poseidon as probably a reference to Sidon, the son of Canaan. And we suspect that these are both references to what the Bible calls in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And we think that there were two divisions. The initial division was dividing the earth into four quarters, which would be one for each son and a double portion for the firstborn son, according to the patriarchal way of dividing the world. The three sons of Noah, he would have divided it into four quarters and then given one to each son, and then the firstborn would have gotten a double portion. But then it was further subdivided into territories, because you had the great grandsons and everything else. At the time of the division, it appears that there were about 70 tribes who divided the world. So using this theory, a number of people have noticed that there is this meridian around the world. It's like tilted up by 30 degrees, and you have these structures built along this meridian all the way around the earth from Egypt to Easter Island.
Wow.
And they all have the same megalithic polygonal stone architecture. These weird polygonal stones that you see at people mainly are familiar with them from Peru, but they're found on the pyramid of Menkaure, who was the fourth dynasty, who we place in the lifetime of Abraham. It's found basically at Tiwanaku and several sites in Peru that are on this line, and it's found at Easter Island. And if you took the equator and you tilted it up by 30 degrees, that's the line that you get. It would tilt up on the side of Africa because the equator is actually down here in Kenya. But it would tilt down on the backside of the earth, and so the line would go through Easter Island, and it's a 30-degree tilt. And if you look at where the line currently is and you draw the meridian, the vertical line, or the meridian, sorry, the prime meridian. I guess I used the word meridian wrong just a minute ago. This would not be a meridian. This is a meridian. At any rate, it seems to match the rough area of wherever Noah's Ark was, somewhere in the mountains of Urartu. This is a pretty broad band, but effectively, somewhere near wherever the Ark was appears to be where they had divided the world and used that as their prime meridian. So in that scenario, the quarter of the earth, we know that Ham inherited Africa, and it actually would include part of Arabia. And even the Bible mentions that some of the tribes of Havilah were here, Havilah being one of the descendants of Ham. It would appear that theoretically he would have gotten the southern half of South America. And there is actually a British gentleman named John Allen who has written a series of books called Bolivian Atlantis, and he argues that South America was the island described as Atlantis, and where it says the capital city was on the long side, there was a high plain about halfway up, and the capital city was in that high plain, and he's saying that the Altiplano was that high plain. And we do find all kinds of weird ancient ruins there related to mining metal. And so he basically argues that this was Atlantis, and then we would argue that we agree, and we even think that this was basically the portion of Canaan. And the book of Jubilees says that Canaan did not want to go, his land was far away to the west, and he didn't want to go, so he seized on the area of Levant, which became called Canaan after him. They built the cities of Sidon and Byblos and Beirut, or Beirut. And effectively, they at first didn't want to go, and they squatted on what was apparently Shem's inheritance. At least that's according to the Book of Jubilees. So we would argue that eventually they did go, and they did colonize their land eventually. And what was established was effectively a source of metal and trade going between South America and the Mediterranean that was being run by the Canaanites, and that this is what the Egyptians were calling Atlantis.
That's really, I mean, that's a really interesting connection, I think, because it's in Peru that you actually see a lot of evidence of child sacrifice in particular. So that could be suggestive of some kind of connection between Canaan and that region.
Yes, you definitely see a very similar religion of even going further and worshiping the sun god and believing that the sun god requires human blood to continue giving light. That was a Canaanite idea that you also find in the Americas, specifically the Aztecs. Okay, so that's the Atlantis theory in a nutshell. I don't want to go too crazy with it. Just we believe that the ancients weren't stupid. They didn't know how to navigate the world. The Greeks, even before Plato, there was one of the other it may not have been Dicaearchus, one of the other Greek philosopher guys. He basically wrote a book, and he described the world outside of the Straits of Gibraltar. There's a great ocean, and there are 3 great islands and about 10 smaller islands. And he describes these 3 great islands, and he appears to be describing North America, South America, and Antarctica. So the idea that the ancients could have mapped the world has been discussed by, for example, Charles Hapgood and a lot of others. And since we're talking about apologetics, I mean, really, my whole study of history is apologetics for the Bible, and you are an apologist as well, whether you call yourself that or not, I don't know. But we have a lot of these ancient aliens channels on YouTube, and you have a lot of young people that are being, I think, deceived, where they show evidence of ancient high technology, evidence that there was an ancient civilization that did stuff around the world. And then they conclude, oh, this must have been built by ancient aliens. The pyramids weren't built by men. They were built by, people from outer space. And I think that it's important that we recognize, no, the pyramids were not built by people from outer space. And no, the evidence that you see of an ancient world civilization is the evidence from the patriarchal era, where you had these pre-flood patriarchs who lived a very long time, 500 years after the flood. They came from what was probably a higher technology society, maybe even as high as ours, maybe beyond ours. And so they had this massive amount of knowledge, and they had a lot of centuries left in their own lives to do something with it. And so Noah's attempt to establish the 70 nations of the earth, as God commanded him to, led to dividing the earth, mapping the earth, or in reverse order, mapping the earth first and then dividing it. And so I think that these technologies that they see in Egypt, like say where they were cutting granite with some kind of very sharp, well, clearly power tools of some kind, those are not evidence of aliens. Those are evidence of the ancient patriarchs having knowledge that they brought from before the flood, through the flood on the ark. They had a library. And there's even Sumerian legends where the gods are fighting over these tablets, which contain knowledge and technology. So I think that the patriarchs were the ones who were fighting over those tablets a little bit, and that they were the ones who did this stuff. And if you look at the Great Pyramid, it's amazing. I mean, and again, there's a lot of people who turn it almost into a cult, but this was built by someone who had engineering knowledge that was on par with anything that we have today. So sorry for rambling.
No, incredibly interesting. So tell us a little bit then about the period of the judges in relation to the revised chronology, and specifically, what's going on in the world, and do any of the major judges that are described in the Book of Judges, do they appear in other ancient documents?
So the period of the judges, about 480 years, according to the Bible, although that's also including the 40 years of wilderness wandering. So let's say 440. And then it goes all the way to Solomon. You got these Arab tribes who've taken over the Middle East and Egypt, and they apparently held the civilizations they conquered in derision. So they basically only cared about their animals, and so they destroyed things, stole things.
These are the Amalekites, to be clear.
The Amalekites and the other Arab tribes, which are the people of the East, who the Bible calls them, or the Amorites is what archaeologists are calling them today. So we don't have a lot of writing happening in that time period. Like, for example, in Egypt, in the 8th dynasty, we place the first and second intermediate period as the same time. So the 8th dynasty you have the same thing that you're seeing during the 15th dynasty. Is there's almost no writing happening. There's one case of a ruler of the 8th dynasty being buried in the tomb, a pyramid of a previous Egyptian queen. But other than that, they just didn't leave much behind. So we are reliant on these durations that we have. The later Egyptians recorded basically 3 durations that enable us to span the time. Now, in the middle of it, you have this major event that I would call the beginning of the end of the power of this Amalekite coalition, the Phoenician Amalekite coalition. And that would be when Gideon defeated the Amalekites and Midianites, which Jones places in 1251 BC. It doesn't mention Sidon in that chapter, but 3 chapters later in Judges, where Gideon's son Abimelech is suffering something, the prophet comes and tells him that, God enabled you to defeat the Midianites, Amalekites, and Sidonians. So he's lumping those 3 together, and we think that Gideon's defeat of the Amalekites was the same year that Sidon was defeated, and that would also be tied into the legend of Atlantis, where the year that they said that Atlantis was defeated in a war. So it was a big defeat of the Canaanites. But we have this record from about the 1st century. This guy named Philo of Byblos. He recorded and translated into Greek the writings of a Phoenician historian named Sanchoniathon. And Sanchoniathon had basically copied the records of a priest he calls Hiram Ballas, the priest of Yao. And several scholars have identified that as a reference to Gideon, because when Gideon destroyed he destroyed the altar of Baal, the Bible says, so they called him Jerub-Baal, which means he contended with Baal, or let Baal contend with him. But when converted to Greek, it sounds kind of like Hiram Ballas. And also Yao is identifiable as Yahweh. So Sanchoniathon said he got these records of his history from either the priest of or a guy named Hiram Ballas, and he lived around the same time. And so we find one of the major contemporaries of Gideon was this person that the chroniclers called Semiramis. And what we found is it appears to be a person called Tukulti-Ninurta. Now, Tukulti-Ninurta, this is a inscription left by him. He was an Assyrian king, son of Shalmaneser I, conquered Babylon, and left this. They later wrote an epic called the Tukulti-Ninurta epic. And we find a number of durations to them, and our comparison of the chroniclers, you talk about this queen Semiramis who conquered Babylon and defeated the Indians. We've realized that what they're actually talking about is Tukulti-Ninurta, they confuse the Kassites, who at that time were ruling Babylon. Tukulti-Ninurta defeated a Kassite king named Kashtiliash. And in Greek, Kassoi sounds extremely close to the word for Kushite, Kossoi, Kossoi. And the Greeks believe that the Kushites, or Kossoi, that half of them lived in India and half of them lived in Africa. And so they interpreted basically this account of the defeat of the Kassoi, the Kassites, as being the defeat of the Kushites, being the Indians. And so by the time of Diodorus, you have it all twisted up, and the story about Semiramis defeating the Indians is rather fantastic, meaning she made fake elephants, and it scared the horses of the enemy because it smelled funny, and there's this great battle, which she ends up losing anyway. But the long story short is, we believe that they took the real life of Tukulti-Ninurta and they turned it into the story of the second Semiramis. And now the question is whether Tukulti-Ninurta was Semiramis. And we think we found some clues that do suggest in the palace of Tukulti-Ninurta, there's a curse that says, if anyone or a future king erases my name, may the goddess who raised me to this position, the goddess of battle, turn you into a woman. and that's that's unique. There's no other example of that curse in Assyrian history. And it almost sounds like, if you could imagine that Tukulti-Ninurta was a woman masquerading as a man, which all the ancient queens did. I mean, in the second millennium, the Egyptian queens also had to wear a beard to rule. But you might have had one who took it even more seriously and like literally believed that she was a man. And this kind of ties into some of the current events in our time. But left a curse with that little hint that kind of that's that one little trace that tells us this person viewed herself as a woman who was turned into a man and king of the universe. And that man, he is threatening any future king the reverse of what was done to her, meaning that if I was a woman turned into a man, but if you damage my inscription, may the goddess turn you, the man, into a woman. And that's what's there in the archaeological record. So I can't say from this distance if that's the case. I'm not sure. I don't want to go out and go on the record and say Tukulti-Ninurta was definitely a woman, because the depictions sure show somebody who looks like a man. I mean, this looks like a man to me. But then again, that could be a fake beard. Who knows? At any rate, that's the major point in the middle of this time period. Here's a larger chart of Egyptian history. So you've got the Exodus, and we're talking about the period of the Judges. And roughly right in the middle is when you have this battle where Tukulti-Ninurta conquers Babylon, and that effectively begins the downhill slide of the Amalekites, or the Arab coalition, if you will. And it took another 200 years for them to get defeated finally in Egypt by King Saul and King Ahmose the First. And
so there's a major battle in 1 Samuel 15, and I think we often tend to kind of read over these numbers and miss how huge they are. But Saul numbers 200,000 men on foot, and then 10,000 men of Judah. So this is a major war between Israel and Amalek. And could you tell us a little bit about how this war fits into your understanding of the interrelationship between Israel, Egypt, Amalek, and the broader ancient world?
Yes. So using the durations, we were able to align the 18th dynasty of Egypt with the kings of Israel. And we found that the 19th year of Ahmose, which was the year 1063 BC, he defeats the final king of the Hyksos named Kamudi.
And Ahmose is the first king of the 18th dynasty.
Yes. And he had an older brother named Kamos, like his name with a K on the front, who also had fought these Amalekites. And it's unclear. There's this battle in 1063 where he finally defeats them. But 11 years earlier, in 1074, which is the 22nd year of King Saul, there's this previous battle where the previous king, Apophis or Apop in the Egyptian, was killed. And we're not sure if it was Ahmose or Kamos who wrote the inscription, but it describes how they laid an ambush in the valley and besieged the city of Avaris, and then the people Avaris fell, and these Hyksos fled north and they pursued them all the way to a city called Sharuhen. Well, the same exact description is given in 1 Samuel 15, where it says that they laid an ambush in the valley. They overthrew the city, and the Amalekites fled, and they pursued them from Havilah to Shur. And so Havilah appears to be the Hebrew of Avaris, which is a city in Egypt on the border. And Shur that's a known city in southern Israel near Beersheba, and that appears to be the same as the Egyptian Sharuhen. And so Manuel Velikovsky identified this synchronism as Saul being the ally of the Egyptian king who fought. In fact, the Egyptian king said that I am allied to the prince of Retunu, which is the Egyptian name for Canaan. So we even find Saul. The Bible says Saul married the daughter of Ahimaaz. We don't believe that was this Amos, because it would be pretty much impossible for him to be old enough to have a daughter old enough to marry. But he had a grandfather named Amos Sedok Tenre or something to that effect. And so we believe, and that particular Amos, his grandfather, he had several daughters, and we believe that Saul married one of his daughters, and so the Ahimaaz is this guy, and then that would mean that Amos was basically the first cousin with Saul's youngest son Ishbosheth, who we believe was the offspring of that union.
So this would perhaps explain a little bit the origins of this interesting political relationship between Israel and Egypt that appears in Solomon's marriage alliance with the daughter of Pharaoh, and then perhaps which succeeds into the relationship of the Northern Kingdom and Egypt later in history. Do you think that this is the origin of that relationship?
Absolutely. In fact, what's even more interesting is that the first two generations of this 18th dynasty, they use a different theophoric, meaning the name of the god in your name. So Amenhotep is the god Amun, which is based on Ham. Thutmose or Thothmoses, that is based on the god Thoth. But Hatshepsut's based on the god Hathor. So you can see each of them in their name, they have the name of a god. But Ahmose and his grandfather were named after Yah. Now, in Egyptian at the time, Yah was the god of the new moon, but that's effectively the same name used in Israel for Yahweh, because you had a lot of Israelite kings and people who had Yah in their name, like Yahoo, that was basically using the theophoric for their god Yah. And that makes you wonder, why was this line of kings who allied with Saul worshiping a god named Yah? It's very possible that at the dawn of the 18th dynasty, they actually had been worshiping the true God. And then they were corrupted by their priesthood, because the Egyptian state and its priesthood were so closely intertwined that by the middle of the 18th dynasty, they were completely pagan. That's a bit of reading between the lines. I don't want to go too far out on a limb there, but
Sure.
yeah.
Just out of curiosity, you can just decline to answer if you're not sure. I've heard some people suggest that Ptah has some kind of relationship with Yah. Have you heard that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Ka,
Ptah.
Ka, that means spirit, and I think
H. The god Ptah.
Oh, Ptah.
Yeah.
I think Ptah seems to be based on Cain, actually.
Okay.
Sorry. He's the great he's like the great Egyptian technological creator god, but it's also extremely common for these ancient polytheistic cultures to take the attributes of the true God, the creator, and then attach them to certain of their gods based on humans.
Right. Okay.
So there could be aspects of Ptah which are based on the true God, their memory of the true God. So I'm not going to say that Ptah was only Cain, but it was also based on Cain.
Sure. Okay, so one of the most interesting things I think about your revision of ancient history is you reduce, and correct me if I've got the logic of this wrong. You've reduced the dating of the Empire of Hammurabi down to about the period of the United Monarchy in Israel, and then the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and so that places this archive called the Mari letters at the time of the United Monarchy. So do I have that right? Just to check.
Yes, you do.
Okay, so you've identified King Saul with a specific person in the Mari letters. So could you just explain how you identify the synchronism, and what reasons do we have for thinking that this person really is King Saul?
Sure. So I went back to the slide about the middle of the period of the judges. From the fall of Akkad until the destruction of Babylon by Tukulti-Ninurta, we actually have a very precise chronology, both from the Sumerian king list and we have the year names of these cities. So we actually have, like, we know the name of every year. We don't necessarily have them all in the right order, but we have pretty much a nearly exhaustive knowledge of this time period, and going all the way down to Hammurabi. We have, so the synchronism at the beginning is the fall of Akkad. It's 1477, like, ties the beginning of this period. But we also have a synchronism in the 8th year of Ishbi era. He says the Amorite city was destroyed. He was the first king of the Eisen dynasty. And that 8th year, the Amorite city destroyed, perfectly matches the year that Tukulti-Ninurta conquered Babylon, which was called the Amorite city. And in fact, the dynasty of Babylon that Hammurabi came from was called the Amorite dynasty of Babylon. So we believe that Hammurabi's dynasty began within a few generations after the conquest of Babylon by the Assyrians. The Kassites are still there, and they are still involved. But it's more like you have a Kassite dynasty that's running from the city of Nippur, and they were the dominant military power that was the foil to Assyria. But then you have the actual kings of Babylon were the Amorite dynasty of Babylon, and so it's a different dynasty reigning in that city. And that Hammurabi and his father were the two who became so powerful that they overthrew both the Kassites and the Assyrians, and they became the dominant power. So what we find, so unfortunately, this is such cutting-edge research that I don't have some good figures and drawings for it yet. What we find is that we can count the years down, and that the contemporary of King David and King Saul and King David was a man named Shamshi-Adad, the fourth of Assyria. But the Assyrian king list has taken his deeds and his reign, and they pushed him back. Well, they basically attributed his deeds to a much, much older king called Shamshi-Adad the first, who did exist around the time of Abraham, or maybe a little bit later than that. But they basically, for some political reason, they moved Shamshi-Adad back, but they left a place marker in the Assyrian king list for Shamshi-Adad IV, which records the actual guy and the year that he conquered Assyria, which would have been, I believe, 1053 BC, which is two years after King David became king. Well, Shamshi-Adad we have these letters between him and a king named Ishi-Adu. Ishi-Adu is the son of the previous king named Amut-Piel the first, who was the enemy of Shamshi-Adad. They fought against each other, and they were fighting over territory along the Euphrates River near Mari. Go back. I'm going to try to find my map. Okay. So you've got the city of Mari here. So Shamshi-Adad had conquered Ashur, but he didn't use Ashur as his capital. He built a city right up here called Shubat Enlil, and made that his capital. And so we believe that he actually was a Hurrian Mitannian king, also known in a different language as Shaushtatar. And he was the great-great-grandfather of a guy named Tushratta, who shows up in the Elamar letters. So at any rate, they're fighting over Mari with this king named Amut-Piel, who's a king of Katna. Katna being in the city, Katana, that's today in Syria, and it's about 150 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. Well, this name Amut-Piel means servant of the god El. So you have this northern king fighting a southern king who is a servant of the god El. This southern king dies, and he has a son named Ishi-Adu who takes the throne. And Shamshi-Adad wants to make a treaty with him, so he makes a marriage treaty for his son, who was the king of Mari, to marry the daughter of this king of Katna, and she would be the chief wife. And so there's all these letters back and forth that were found in the Mari archives about the arrangement of this marriage. And then Ishi-Adu, unfortunately, he faces this rebellion. And it's, of course, for those of us who read the Bible, once we identify who Ishi-Adu is, we realize the rebellion were the good guys. But at any rate, he's facing this rebellion, and so Shamshi-Adad sends his troops, and also there's a king of Eshnunna. He sends troops, but the kingdom of Yamhad, he's serving Shamshi-Adad, but he's also secretly supporting the rebellion against Katna. And one of the letters from Ishiadu complains that this king of Yamhad, he will never be friends with him because that guy is supporting the rebellion. So this rebellion lasts for about 6 years, and then all of a sudden Ishiadu disappears. And we identify Ishiadu as Ishbosheth, whose actual name, the Bible calls him Ishbosheth in Samuel, but it calls him in Kings, or maybe in Chronicles. It calls him in Chronicles, but by Ishbaal. Well, Baal is the storm god, the pagan storm god of the Canaanites, but Adu or Adad is also the name of the storm god for the Hurrians and the Hittites. And so if you wanted to translate the name Ishbaal into Akkadian, which was the diplomatic language that they used to write all these letters to each other, Baal becomes Adu or Adad. So Ishiadu means man of the storm god Adad, and Ishbaal means man of the storm god Baal. And that's why the Bible calls him Ishbosheth. Bosheth means shame. And you see this in the Hebrew Bible, a number of places where they convert the pagan god's name to a name like Bosheth, which means shame. They also do that with the word Asherah. They take the name of the goddess Astarte, and they change the consonants and vowels to make it a form of shame. So at any rate, we believe Ishiadu was Ishbosheth, and we have his letters, many of his letters, and unfortunately his end. And he wrote very similar letters to what we see in the Bible. In the Bible, the downfall of Ishbosheth was that he basically insulted his commander Abner by criticizing him for having married the widow of King Saul. King Saul had a harem, and Abner married one of the older ladies who was a widow of Saul. And Ishbosheth calls him out for it, and Abner basically says, fine, I'll go over and help David. I'll defect. And he does. So Ishbosheth did not have the wisdom to recognize the weight of an insult and what should be overlooked with regard to his strategic allies. Well, this Ishiadu, he's writing letters to these kings of Mari. So Shamshi-Adad, he places one of his sons as king of Mari, and that's named Yasma-Adad. He has another son named Ishmi-Dagan, and he makes him king of Ecolatum, which they haven't found it yet. They don't know where the city of Ecolatum was. It may have been down here near Eshnunna, may have been up north. At any rate, Ishmi-Dagan is a very powerful king. And there's this letter from Ishiadu to Ishmi-Dagan where Ishiadu says, I sent you 2 white horses as a gift, and all you sent me back was a lump of tin, which is worthless. Why would you even bother to send me a gift like a lump of tin? And,
people don't change that much, do they?
Yeah. So this is the same guy. He is so focused on the detail of what he's owed and not wanting to lose, a penny, that he does not see the strategic value of his allies. And so at any rate, that's an identification that we make. And once we have made that identification, it becomes clear that the kings of this kingdom called Katna, which on the map here, it only goes down to Hazor, but we believe that Katna was the name that they were using for Israel. It's named after this city, Katna, but we believe Katna was the city of Dan, not Tel Dan, which is down here, which Tel Dan's been excavated, and they've never found any writing that says this is Dan. But here we have an entire city they dug up. They found the royal archives, they found the royal tombs, and they found all these letters. And this was clearly a royal city of this dynasty. At the beginning of the dynasty, they can't find any evidence that they were worshiping idols. But at some point in the dynasty, there's a king named Yahad-Abum, and with him, they start seeing dedications to idols. And Yahad-Abum has a son named Sinadu, which appears to be Jeroboam the first and his son Nadab. So at any rate, that is worth an entire episode, and really I think that our next episode together we're just going to talk about the kings of Katna as the kings of Israel.
Yeah.
And that kind of concludes my comments.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really interesting and exciting episode. I've been really enthused by the responses that we've been getting in the comments. A lot of people have written me privately to say just how intriguing this series has been. So please keep us both in your prayers, and please keep this project in your prayers, because, unless the Lord builds the house, it's all in vain. So thank you so much for coming on, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you so much, Seraphim. God be with you.